G'day, I'm Graeme. I'm an environmental scientist and I'm in my element here in a woodland with Mount Dandenong in the background there. And I've spent a lot of my career looking after native flora and fauna. And I put forward this as the first of a series of videos on how to manage environmentally harmful plants in natural and semi-natural ecosystems. But first, I need to provide some definitions. I call a plant indigenous if it's growing in its natural range and in the natural sort of habitat. Most of the plants in this woodland are indigenous here, but this wonga vine I'd say is not. That's because it belongs in a wet forest or a mountain ash forest or a rainforest. And prior to 25 years ago, it didn't occur any closer to this than about 2 kilometres away in the Dandenong Ranges. So I would call this not an indigenous plant. Now, you can call a plant like this a weed if you like. A weed is just a subjective term that means that you don't want that plant growing where it happens to be. But for the purposes of managing a natural or semi-natural area, we need a more objective definition of a particular sort of weed. We call them environmental weeds. Here's my carefully crafted definition of environmental weed. It's a plant that is displacing indigenous flora and fauna, except if that plant is displacing flora and fauna as part of a natural cycle. This definition excludes any non-indigenous plant that is not displacing indigenous flora and fauna. For example, annuals confined to the edges of paths. Those plants are not environmental problems, as I'll explain later. Environmental weeds do include any population of an indigenous species that has become so out of ecological balance that it is displacing other indigenous plants or animals. Examples from forests to the east of Melbourne include unnaturally dense regrowth of yarraburgen or weeping grass, or the small-leaf clematis, Clematis decipiens. I'd call this wonga vine an environmental weed because its foliage is so dense that it's blocking photosynthesis to the plants underneath. And some of the plants around here are actually climbing up other plants to such an extent that it's making shrubs fall down and die. Also, underneath, the habitat for lizards is being impaired. So it's having those negative impacts on the indigenous flora and fauna. Even in a nearby garden, a wonga vine can be an environmental weed because its wind-blown seeds can blow into this woodland and displace indigenous plants. Sweet Potosporum's a lovely plant in a garden. What's happened here is that around 30 years ago this fence was put in. At that stage the vegetation was the same on each side. On this side, volunteers have continually removed the sweet Potosporums, and on this side, the owners of the private land have left it as they are. The result is that, as you can see, there's a much different understory on this side of the fence compared with the other side of the fence, and the whole structure of the vegetation is different there. Have a look underneath the sweet Potosporums. The Potosporums compete strongly against indigenous plants for sunlight, soil moisture and nutrients. I've watched the indigenous ground cover slowly die out. The Potosporums are therefore acting as environmental weeds here. A primary goal that many people have for managing natural and semi-natural areas is to eliminate or minimise the non-indigenous plants. A main reason for that is that the sight of non-indigenous plants offends our idea of what a natural area should look like. But what if those non-indigenous plants are of very little environmental consequence at all, like the annual weeds along the edge of the path here? And what if trying to control them is really just a very temporary thing and takes away resources from what could be doing greater environmental benefit? And what if the act of trying to get rid of these non-indigenous plants actually causes harm to the indigenous flora or fauna, such as the locally rare helmet orchids that used to occur along here until they were accidentally sprayed with herbicide? What about other environmental weeds that have some redeeming qualities, like providing habitat for fauna whose natural habitat has been severely depleted? In these cases, controlling the non-Indigenous plants comes with a cost and can be harmful to the Indigenous flora. Conversely, sometimes doing things to advantage the Indigenous flora and fauna also encourages environmental weeds or minor weeds like these on the edge of the path. For example, I organise a burn in this reserve about every 20 years or so in order to benefit the rare plants that occur here, particularly orchids. And I do that even knowing that that same act of encouraging the orchids will also encourage annual weeds like fleabanes and sow thistles to germinate in the wake of the fire. So there's no one-to-one correspondence between removing non-Indigenous plants and encouraging native flora and fauna. It's all too easy to think that by making an area look more natural, by removing non-Indigenous plants, we actually make the area more natural and more ecologically healthy, even if we're not noticing that the penalty for doing that is sometimes to cause harm to the Indigenous flora and fauna, or to divert resources that should be placed elsewhere, or that may be very temporary and not really give us any significant benefit. I would encourage you instead to think about not just the way things look and that there are non-Indigenous plants present, but rather look for the more fundamental and challenging task of really favouring the Indigenous flora and fauna. And in order to do that, you'll need some ecological principles. The first principle is about disturbance and competition. Native vegetation is a hotbed of competition. Periodically, I organise a fire in this area in order to stimulate regeneration. It shifts the competition according to different species. For a couple of years, maybe 3 years after a burn, a particular group of species are favoured, such as these fireweeds that came up copiously in last year's burn. There are also copious seedlings down at ground level. Almost all Victorian ecosystems, other than rainforests, need those cycles. And in between those cycles, there's a range of species that rely on sporadic, small amounts of disturbance that might come about from a bandicoot or an echidna digging, scratching the ground and stimulating germination of species. The trouble is that humans have introduced all kinds of plants and animals and fungi. And so when disturbance occurs now, it's just as likely that you'll be encouraging those introduced species rather than the indigenous species. This has major implications for management of natural and semi-natural areas. When there's disturbance, which might even be after you've been doing weed control, you can expect introduced species, not just the natural ones, to take advantage of that. There's an ecological principle that disturbance is the way that environmental weeds become established in natural and semi-natural environments. I'll give credit to the great Australian ecologist Marilyn Fox for pioneering that, and for further reading I recommend the reference below. Now, just because disturbance is the way that environmental weeds become established in natural systems doesn't mean that they're all worth worrying about. For example, after the fire here, up came a whole lot of fleabanes in the genus Erigeron and sow thistles. Species like that only persist for 2 or 3 years before they disappear, unless there is ongoing disturbance. So again, you need to consider the disturbance when you're thinking about how to manage environmental weeds. That brings me to the ecological concept of a spectrum of species between opportunists on the one hand and competitors on the other. Opportunists are the species that establish very rapidly when there is a newly available vacant ecological niche. and the competitors are the ones that take a lot longer to establish following the creation of a newly vacant ecological niche. And there is a spectrum of species that fall in between the two extremes. So over time, after an event like the fire that occurred here, initially there is a flourishing of the opportunistic species, particularly daisies like the fleabanes I just mentioned, as well as the fireweeds I showed you. But they only last for a couple of years, and rapidly they become outcompeted by species that are slower to get started, but eventually outcompete the opportunists because they're often larger, and so they capture more sunlight, which means they can make better use of the nutrients and moisture in the soil. So we've got this spectrum between the opportunists and the competitors. And how you deal with those as environmental weeds really matters. Opportunists, we know, are reliant on that vacant ecological niche being created. So if it's continually being created, such as by feet on the edge of the path next to me, you will always have the opportunistic species. And trying to get rid of them is fruitless unless you deal with the underlying cause of that disturbance. On the other hand, if you were able to stop the disturbance, such as by closing off a path, here we find that the opportunistic weeds disappear of their own accord. In a long undisturbed environment, opportunistic species disappear over time. But on the edge of the path, the unrelenting disturbance of foot traffic creates conditions that are always conducive to the opportunistic species. And that includes things like flatweeds, as in the case of this cudweed, and ribwort down here, and a range of grass species that are introduced and opportunistic on the edge of the path here. And so these species are going to persist here indefinitely as long as there is foot traffic creating the disturbance. You might also notice that there is a maroon hood orchid just here, because it turns out that a lot of orchid species are also somewhat opportunistic. And that's the problem with trying to do too much control of opportunistic species, as well as getting rid of the introduced ones. It's quite likely you're going to inadvertently destroy something like an orchid on the edge of the path. This issue of the relationship between disturbance and the establishment of environmental weeds is of particular importance for floodplains and stream channels, wetlands and shorelines, because those environments are subject to natural continual disturbance, which we can't abate. I think you can see it's quite important to be able to tell whether a species is more on the opportunistic end of the spectrum. Here are 3 ways that I suggest you can get an idea of that. The first one is to check the root system, because many opportunistic species have got very shallow root systems, very wispy root systems. So when you gently pull them up, as you can see here, there's very little to it. The second test is to see whether those species are clustered in the more disturbed parts of the environment, such as along the edges of the paths. And if they don't seem to be spreading beyond that particular part of the environment, it's likely to be an opportunistic species and probably not of too much concern. The third test is to watch how quickly the plant grows from a seedling to reproductive maturity. Now, the concept of a spectrum between opportunists and competitors leads me to another ecological concept involving a spectrum, this time between drivers of ecological change on one end of the spectrum and passengers on the other side. Drivers are species which are so profound in their impact that they actually cause change. Whereas a passenger species is one which can only really occur there as a result of environmental change. So it's more a symptom rather than a cause of an environmental problem. There are also species that some people called backseat drivers because they're unable to cause environmental change in the outset, but once another driver species transforms the landscape somewhat, then the backseat driver species are able to take over. Some people also talk about transformer species, but I don't think we need to get concerned about that. If your objective is to maximise the habitat for indigenous flora and fauna, obviously the environmental weeds you need to focus on are the driver species, not the passenger species. Some of the passenger species may even have redeeming features, such as providing habitat for fauna. Opportunistic weeds along the edge of a path are classic passenger species, and the traffic of feet along the edge that allows them to be there is the ecological driver. Weeds immediately downhill of the edge of a road or a railway line are also usually passenger species, and the driver in that case is things like runoff of moisture and nutrients and weed seeds. Dealing with the weeds themselves without dealing with the cause of them being there is fruitless. Unfortunately, it's often difficult to tell whether a species is more on the driver's end of the spectrum or the passenger end of the spectrum, or somewhere in the middle. Here are some tests that I use most commonly. The first is just a screening test. If the species at issue represents only a small fraction of the foliage cover of its layer of vegetation, and if it isn't increasing over time without control, it probably has low potential as a driver species. That might not be the case if it has unusual properties such as being quite toxic to wildlife. Conversely, a non-indigenous species that has high foliage cover, like this clematis, is capable of monopolising sunlight, soil moisture and nutrients, and thereby potentially act as a driver. However, it's only a driver if it isn't relying on some other factor to make the environment suitable for it. This Panicfelt grass is a case in point. It's growing quite densely here, as it usually does under cherry ballot trees. And that makes people often think that it's a real problem and needs a lot of effort to control it. People also find that after controlling it, it keeps coming back and they just cannot get rid of it. So it's developed a popular reputation as the weed from hell. However, the species never moves very far here from underneath the cherry ballards because of a particular property of what happens to soil underneath the cherry ballard species. And so I would say that this species is not a driver species, it's more a passenger, and the driver is what the cherry ballard species are doing to the soil underneath. And any attempt to remove the Panicfelt grass without dealing with the driver that allows it to be here is fairly futile. Unfortunately, cherry ballards are an important part of the woodland here and in a whole range of vegetation types in Victoria. So it's not a simple matter to just get rid of the driver. So in situations like this, in this reserve, we simply have to accept that we are not going to be able to effectively remove Panicfelt grass. And in fact, that doesn't matter quite as much as you might think, because even in a pristine environment, not many indigenous plants grow underneath cherry ballards. So the Panicfelt grass isn't displacing a whole lot. My next test for a driver species is to see whether, when you remove a species, the environment improves significantly as a result. I've already given you the example of sweet Potosporums, where on one side of the fence, where they've been allowed to grow, there is very little native flora and fauna. And on the other side of the fence, where the sweet Potosporums were removed, the environment is much healthier with far more species of flora and fauna. Other scientists have shown scientifically that sweet Potosporum can behave as a driver of ecological change in a range of vegetation communities in Victoria. My last and less favoured test is to observe change over time in the absence of any control measures. For example, by watching a species spread across the area of interest, with ecological deterioration occurring behind, but not in front of, what you might call the invasion front. My final ecological principle for this video is what I call Lorimer's first law of weeding. It is, when in doubt, don't pull it out, or don't spray it out. What I mean is, don't do any harm. If you're uncertain about the identity of a particular plant and you think it might be an environmental weed, don't pull it out. If you're unsure whether it's just an opportunistic weed or a driver weed, err on the side of leaving it alone until you can check these things. Refer to other people who might have a better idea. But you can do far more harm in inadvertently pulling out or destroying an indigenous species or destroying fauna habitat than you can ever make good over 1,000 days of doing environmental weeding. To summarise this video, here are what I think are the take-home messages. Number 1, when in doubt, don't pull it out. Point 2, whether a plant is an environmental weed depends on its capacity to displace indigenous flora and fauna. Point 3, ecological disturbances are important for ecosystem health and the survival of some flora and fauna species, but they also promote environmental weeds. Point 4, the environmental weeds that depend most on disturbances are called opportunists. There's rarely any point in trying to remove them if the disturbance they thrive on is going to continue. And point 5, there is a spectrum between driver species and passenger species, which again helps determine how much importance to place on control of each environmental weed species. But there are other equally important things that need to be taken into consideration when you're working out the priority to be given to a particular environmental weed problem. That will be the subject of the next video. G'day, Graeme here, back for my second instalment on environmental weeds. Last time I explained how different environmental weeds have different levels of seriousness, some much more so than others. I also gave you some ecological principles to apply to work out which ones are most serious and how the different species will behave. This time, I'm going to explain a whole lot of additional factors that need to be taken into account to work out the priority to be given to any particular environmental weed problem. I've been able to identify 5 separate steps to work out the priorities. The first point is the seriousness of the environmental weed problem. What sort of impact it's having in displacing indigenous flora and fauna. The second point is how rapidly and how far the environmental weed problem is likely to spread. The third point is the tractability of the environmental weed control. That is, how effectively we can get rid of the weeds, how long-lasting the impact is going to be, and what sort of risks there are to safety or to the environment. The fourth point is what other sorts of pros and cons does a particular environmental weed have outside the environmental sphere. For example, a pine tree might be an environmental weed, but it might have historical value. Or hemlock has toxicity. The fifth point is whether there are legal obligations to remove an environmental weed or not, or whether you need a permit to get rid of it. Let's take the example of this small-leaf clematis or Clematis decipiens here. We'll go through the 5 points. Point 1, how serious is it? Well, this is a listed endangered vegetation type. And as I look at this expanse of small-leafed clematis, you can see it's really smothering vegetation and is likely to make shrubs fall over and become damaged, and it's taking up so much of the sunlight that it is adversely impacting on all of the plants and the fauna underneath them. And in fact, there are some rare plants scattered through this area. So on all of those counts, I would say that the seriousness of this particular environmental weed problem is at least moderate. Point 2 is the rate of spread of the environmental weed problem. In this case, I've watched this small-leaf clematis start from a small patch a couple of years ago and has rapidly enlarged to cover most of the ground, and it's getting larger around the edges. Also, it produces copious wind-blown seed, so particularly the ones elevated are going to be able to blow much further and create problems elsewhere. So it's serious on the spread score as well. Point 3 is how tractable the weed is to control. In this case, it can be removed without much risk to the safety of the people doing it or to the environment by manually pulling it out. I think we can do a pretty good job of that, and to have it create a lasting impact with only fairly irregular follow-up action to make sure it doesn't come back again. So I call this a fairly tractable environmental weed problem. Point 4 is whether there are other aspects outside the environmental area that might affect whether we deal with this. In this case, it's an attractive plant, but few people come to this part of the landscape, and so its beauty is probably not a significant factor. In some circumstances, this species will require a permit to remove it, so that needs to be taken into account. Which takes me to point 5. Are there any legal requirements to deal with this environmental weed? Not in this case. But, as I said, a permit is often required. That's because small-leaf clematis is indigenous in much of the Melbourne region, and in many cases it forms important habitat and doesn't become rampant. It's just that in some species you can have too much of a good thing. In the last video I mentioned burgon, wonga vine and weeping grass as other examples. And if you're uncertain whether a plant is a problem, remember Lorimer's first law of weeding. When in doubt, don't pull it out. As a counterexample, look at the Panicfelt grass growing underneath these cherry ballot trees. Point 1, is it serious? I'd say it's not all that serious because although it's dense, I know that even in a pristine environment, not many indigenous plants grow under cherry ballot trees. So even if we completely eradicated the Panicfelt grass, there wouldn't be a whole lot of indigenous flora or fauna that would benefit from it. Point 2, what about its spread? I'd say it isn't at great risk of spread. And that's because over the 30-odd years that I've been coming to this spot regularly, it hasn't spread at all from underneath the cherry ballards. That's a very common phenomenon with Panicfelt grass being confined underneath the cherry ballards. Ants may spread the seeds further afield, but I've never seen the Panicfelt grass established beyond the confines of the cherry ballards. Point 3, how tractable is it? Well, it's easy to pull out. You could use chemicals, but you can avoid the risk of using chemicals. And so you could, in principle, remove the species. Many people try and do that, but what they find is that it's only very temporary. So although it's tractable as a one-off exercise to remove it, it's not tractable in the long term. It doesn't provide any lasting benefit, and that's a real problem. Point 4, does it have redeeming qualities? I can't think of any. You might like the grass and it might provide some seeds for a few ants, but I don't see that as a big deal from a biodiversity conservation point of view. And point 5, there's no legal obligation to do anything about it. So my fellow volunteers and I have decided that there are better things for us to spend our time on to look after flora and fauna than to put a lot of effort into controlling something like this. Of course, it offends our desire to have a landscape that looks natural, and this doesn't. But that's a different issue from looking after the flora and fauna. And if we can only do one, our job as volunteers is to look after the flora and fauna. Noticed how I used the concept of passenger and driver species when I assessed the seriousness of the clematis or the Panicfelt grass, and also how long-lasting the control of these species would be. If I was dealing with an opportunist species like a fleabane, I'd also be thinking about whether disturbance that kept on going was going to make my efforts at control futile. You probably also noticed that I relied on quite a bit of personal experience when I assessed the different weeds. Always make the best use you can of people's experience. Discuss it with other people. And if you're still left in uncertainty, remember Lorimer's first law of weeding. When in doubt, don't pull it out. You can do far more damage by inadvertently doing something wrong. Now, being a scientist, I would love to have a formula that told me from the scores that I might give each of those 5 points what priority I should be giving to any particular environmental weed problem. Unfortunately, I don't know of any such formula. The best I can come up with is this thing called a triage matrix, which I've adapted from these guys Downey et al. This is what the triage matrix looks like. The 9 white cells contain suggested management actions in response to any particular environmental weed problem, depending on how we would characterise that problem on the left-hand side of the table and on the top row of the table. Starting with the left-hand side of the table, it says level of threat to biodiversity based on my point 1, how serious the environmental weed problem is to biodiversity, and my point 2, the potential for the problem to get worse, either by spreading or becoming denser. And we have to choose between ratings high, medium, and low. To take that example of the Panicfelt grass underneath the cherry bellots, I would say that the potential is very low because it hasn't shown any sign of moving out from under the cherry bellots for years. I'd also say that the seriousness is on the lower end of the spectrum, and that would mean that we would be looking at a management action from the lowest row of the table. And we'd choose between those 3 according to the tractability that's listed at the top here. That's my point 3, that is the effectiveness with which we could expect to achieve lasting environmental improvement safely to humans and the environment. Again, we have to choose between high, medium, and low. And to take that example of the Panicfelt grass again, I would say that the tractability is low, based on the fact that as long as the cherry bellots remain, the Panicfelt grass will keep coming back each time we remove it, so we can't achieve lasting improvement. Given that I've put low as the rating both on the left-hand side and on the top, that puts it in the bottom right cell of the table. Category I, no action required until higher priorities are satisfied. To take the other example of the small-leaf clematis, that's more up this side of the table, I would say that the level of threat to biodiversity is high based on the fact that the vegetation type is endangered, there are locally threatened plants present, they are becoming smothered, which is affecting some fauna habitat, and the rate of spread is high based on the windblown seed and the observation that new plants keep coming up in the area. I would also say that the tractability is high there based on the capacity to remove the small-leaf clematis using manual means quite safely and with a reasonable prospect of achieving a lasting improvement. With high on both the left-hand side and the top of the table, that gives me this response. Category A, weed management is critical, immediate, targeted, and long-term. So you can see that if I was faced between the 2 options of dealing with the Panicfelt grass and the small-leaf clematis, I would definitely go for the small-leaf clematis. A word of caution though, the triage matrix doesn't take into account the non-environmental attributes of a plant, such as the historical value of a pine tree, and it doesn't take into account legal requirements. I hope you'll find the triage matrix and my 5-point method of determining priorities for environmental weeds useful, as well as the ecological principles and concepts that I gave you in the previous video, as well as Lorimer's first law of weeding. That's the end of this video, and I hope there'll be more. I'll leave you with one last look at the 5 points to work out the priority of environmental weeds.